Did you see what happened when a 6-year-old Neil Diamond stood on stage, barely able to reach the microphone, looking terrified and small in front of hundreds of people? The judges were ready to send him home, the audience was getting impatient, and everyone thought this tiny boy was too young and too scared to perform. But the moment he opened his mouth and started to sing, something extraordinary happened that nobody in that auditorium would ever forget. What this little boy did in those few minutes revealed the superstar he would become decades later. Stay until the end, because this story will show you that true talent cannot be hidden no matter how young or scared you are. It was the late spring of 1947 in Brooklyn, New York, and PS 174, a public elementary school in a working-class Jewish neighborhood, was holding its annual talent show. The school served the children of immigrants and working-class families, people who had come to America seeking better lives for their children. These were not wealthy families with resources for private music lessons or fancy instruments. These were families where fathers worked long hours as tailors or merchants or laborers, where mothers managed households on tight budgets, where every penny had to be carefully considered. The talent show was a big event for the school and the community. It gave children a chance to showcase whatever abilities they had, whether it was reciting poetry, performing a little skit, playing an instrument, or singing. Parents would pack the auditorium to watch their children perform, and local community leaders would be invited to serve as judges. For the children, it was both exciting and terrifying, a chance to be in the spotlight, but also to potentially embarrass themselves in front of everyone they knew. Among the children scheduled to perform that evening was a boy named Neil Leslie Diamond. He was 6 years old, small for his age, with dark hair and serious brown eyes that seemed too old for his young face. Neil was the son of Akiba and Rose Diamond. His father, who went by Kiev, was a dry goods merchant who worked long hours trying to make enough money to support his family. His mother, Rose, was a homemaker who managed their modest household and tried to give her children a stable, loving home despite their financial struggles. Neil had always been different from other children. He was quieter, more introspective, more sensitive. While other boys his age were rough and tumble, playing aggressive games and showing off, Neil would sit and listen when adults talked, would watch people with an intensity that was unusual for someone so young. He felt things deeply, absorbed emotions from the people around him, and often seemed to be processing thoughts and feelings that were too complex for a 6-year-old. Music had captured Neil's attention from the time he was very small. When music played on the radio in their apartment, little Neil would stop whatever he was doing and just listen. He would hum along with melodies, would remember lyrics after hearing a song just once or twice. His parents noticed this but did not think much of it. Many children liked music. That did not mean anything special. But Neil's first-grade teacher, Mrs. Goldstein, noticed something more. She heard Neil singing to himself during quiet time in class, and she was struck by the quality of his voice. It was not just that he could carry a tune, though he could. It was something in the tone, in the way he phrased even simple melodies, that suggested real musical ability. Mrs. Goldstein encouraged Neil to sing more, and when the talent show was announced, she suggested to his parents that Neil should perform. Neil's parents were hesitant. Their son was so shy, so sensitive. Would he be able to stand up in front of all those people and perform? Would the pressure be too much for him? Would he freeze or run off the stage in tears? They did not want to set him up for failure or humiliation. But Mrs. Goldstein was persuasive. She said she had seen something special in Neil and that he should be given the chance to share it. So it was decided. Neil would sing in the talent show. For weeks before the event, he practiced at home. His mother helped him choose a song, something simple and appropriate for a 6-year-old, a popular tune of the day that he could sing without accompaniment. Neil practiced over and over, singing for his mother in their small living room, getting more comfortable with the words and the melody. But practicing at home for his mother was very different from performing on a stage in front of hundreds of people. As the day of the talent show approached, Neil became increasingly nervous. He had trouble sleeping, had trouble eating. His stomach was in knots whenever he thought about standing on that stage. His parents asked him several times if he wanted to back out, told him it was okay if he decided not to do it, but Neil said no. He wanted to try. He was scared, but he wanted to try. The evening of the talent show arrived. The school auditorium was packed with parents, siblings, neighbors, and community members. The judges, 3 respected adults from the neighborhood, including a music teacher from a local high school, sat at a table in the front row with their clipboards and evaluation forms. The principal of PS 174 gave opening remarks, thanking everyone for coming and encouraging applause for all the young performers, regardless of how they did. The show began with various acts. Some children recited poems, stumbling over words but getting through it with encouragement from the audience. Some performed little comedy skits that got polite laughter. A few played instruments with varying degrees of competence. The audience clapped supportively for everyone, understanding that these were just children doing their best. Neil was scheduled to perform near the middle of the show. As his turn approached, he sat backstage feeling like he might be sick. His hands were cold and sweaty. His heart was pounding so hard he could hear it in his ears. When Mrs. Goldstein came to tell him he was next, Neil almost said he could not do it. But he looked at his teacher's encouraging face, and he thought about his mother out in the audience, who had helped him practice so many times, and he forced himself to stand up. The curtain opened, and Neil walked out onto the stage. The auditorium seemed enormous to him, full of faces all looking at him expectantly. The stage lights were bright and hot. Someone had set up a microphone on a stand for the performers to use, but the microphone was set at adult height. When Neil stood in front of it, the microphone was several inches above his head. He could not reach it even when he stretched up on his tiptoes. There was a moment of confusion and some nervous laughter from the audience. This little boy was so small, he could not even reach the microphone. How was he supposed to perform? One of the teachers rushed up to adjust the microphone stand, lowering it down to Neil's height. But even at its lowest setting, it was still a bit too high. Neil had to tilt his head back slightly to sing into it, an awkward position that made him even more uncomfortable. The judges exchanged glances. One of them made a note on his clipboard. This did not look promising. The child was so small, so young, clearly terrified. This might be one of those painful moments where a child freezes up and has to be led off stage. They prepared themselves to be kind in their evaluation, regardless of what happened. The audience grew quiet, waiting. Neil stood at that microphone, looking impossibly small and vulnerable. His face was pale, his eyes were wide with fear. For several long seconds, he just stood there, frozen. Some people in the audience started to whisper. Was he going to sing or not? Should someone go up and help him? What would you do if you were standing in front of hundreds of people as a 6-year-old child, terrified beyond words but determined to sing? Would you run away, or would you find the courage to open your mouth? Leave your answer in the comments and tell us how you would handle this terrifying situation. Then, from somewhere in the audience, Neil heard his mother's voice. She was not shouting, just speaking in a normal, encouraging tone, but in the quiet auditorium it carried. She said, "You can do it, Neil. We believe in you." Those simple words broke through his paralysis. Neil closed his eyes for just a moment, took a deep breath and began to sing. The song he had chosen was "I'll Be Seeing You," a popular ballad from the war years that had become a standard. It was a song about separation and longing and hope, themes that seemed far too mature for a 6-year-old to understand. But as Neil began to sing, something remarkable happened. His voice, which everyone expected to be thin and childish, came out clear and strong and full of an emotion that should not have been possible for someone so young. The first few notes stopped the whispers immediately. People who had been fidgeting in their seats or talking quietly to neighbors suddenly went still. The judges, who had been prepared to give a charitable evaluation, looked up in surprise. This was not what they had expected. This was not a cute child singing a song. This was something else entirely. Neil sang with his eyes closed most of the time, tilted back slightly to reach the too high microphone. But none of that mattered, because what was coming out of this 6-year-old boy was extraordinary. His voice had a quality, a richness and depth that was shocking from someone so young. But more than technical ability, there was feeling in his performance. When he sang about missing someone and hoping to see them again, you could hear real longing, real emotion, as if this little boy somehow understood loss and yearning in a way that transcended his age. The song was just a few minutes long, but it felt like time stopped in that auditorium. The packed room of hundreds of people was completely silent, except for Neil's voice. Parents who had come expecting a pleasant but forgettable evening of children's performances found themselves genuinely moved. Some of the mothers had tears in their eyes. The judges sat transfixed, their clipboards forgotten, simply listening. As Neil sang the final lines of the song, his voice carried clear and pure through the auditorium. When the last note faded, there was a moment of absolute silence. Then the applause began. It started with a few people, and then built until the entire auditorium was clapping. Not the polite, supportive applause they had given the other acts, but genuine, enthusiastic applause. And then something happened that had never happened before in the history of the PS 174 talent show. One of the judges stood up while applauding, then the second judge stood, then the third. The judges were giving this 6-year-old boy a standing ovation. Seeing the judges stand, the audience followed. Within seconds, everyone in that auditorium was on their feet, clapping and cheering for this tiny boy who could barely reach the microphone, but who had just delivered a performance that none of them would ever forget. Neil opened his eyes and looked out at the sea of standing, applauding people. His face showed confusion and wonder. He had been so scared, had expected to fail, and instead this was happening. Neil's mother was crying in the audience, overwhelmed with pride and emotion. His father, a man who rarely showed his feelings publicly, was clapping hard with a huge smile on his face. Mrs. Goldstein, who had believed in Neil and encouraged him to perform, was wiping tears from her eyes. They had all known he could sing, but none of them had fully understood how special his talent was until that moment. The principal had to come on stage and ask everyone to sit down so the show could continue. Neil walked off stage in a daze, still not fully processing what had just happened. Backstage, the other children and teachers surrounded him, congratulating him, telling him how amazing he had been. But Neil was too overwhelmed to really take it in. He just wanted to find his mother. When the talent show ended and the judges announced the results, there was no suspense about who had won. Neil Diamond was awarded first place by unanimous decision. The head judge, the music teacher from the high school, said in his remarks that in all his years of teaching music and judging competitions, he had rarely heard anything like what that young boy had delivered. He said Neil had a gift, a real gift, and that with proper training and support he could go far. Neil's parents took him home that night with the first place ribbon, both proud and slightly overwhelmed by what had happened. They were working-class people with practical concerns about paying rent and putting food on the table. The idea that their shy 6-year-old son might have some special musical destiny seemed both wonderful and frightening. What did it mean? What should they do about it? In the days following the talent show, word spread through the neighborhood about Neil Diamond's performance. People who had been there told people who had not been there. The story grew with each telling. Some people wanted Neil's parents to immediately enroll him in expensive music programs or start pushing him toward a career in entertainment. But Neil's parents were cautious. They did not want to put too much pressure on their young son, did not want to turn him into a performing monkey or steal his childhood. So life went on relatively normally for the Diamond family. Neil continued to attend PS 174, to play with other children, to be a regular kid. But something had changed inside him. That night on the stage, despite his terror, despite barely being able to reach the microphone, despite everything working against him, he had connected with an audience through his voice. He had felt the power of that connection, the way his singing could move people, could make them feel something. It was a feeling he would spend the rest of his life chasing. As Neil got older, music remained his constant companion. He taught himself to play guitar as a teenager, wrote his first songs, performed in school shows and local venues. His parents, seeing his dedication and talent, supported his musical pursuits, even though they worried about the instability of a career in music. They wanted him to have something practical to fall back on, so they encouraged education alongside music. But Neil knew from that night when he was 6 years old and could barely reach the microphone that music was what he was meant to do. The terror he had felt that night, the vulnerability of standing small and scared in front of all those people, And then the incredible feeling when his voice connected with them and they stood and applauded. That experience had branded him. He knew that this was his calling, his purpose, the thing he was put on earth to do. Neil Diamond went on to become one of the most successful singer-songwriters in history. He sold over 130 million records worldwide. He wrote and performed classics like Sweet Caroline, Cracklin' Rosie, I Am I Said, and America. He performed for millions of people in stadiums and arenas around the world. He was inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame and the Songwriters Hall of Fame. He received Grammy Awards, Kennedy Center honors, and countless other accolades. But in interviews throughout his career, when asked about his earliest memory of performing, Neil would often tell the story of that talent show at PS 174 when he was 6 years old. He would talk about being so small that he could not reach the microphone, about being so scared that he almost could not sing, about his mother's voice encouraging him from the audience. He would say that everything he became as a performer started in that moment. Neil said that the lesson he learned that night at 6 years old was that talent and ability do not matter if you do not have the courage to share them. He could have let his fear win. He could have run off that stage. He could have refused to perform in the first place, but he made himself do it, made himself walk out there and sing despite the terror. And because he did, because he pushed through the fear, he discovered something about himself that would shape his entire life. The story of 6-year-old Neil Diamond barely reaching that microphone, but delivering a performance that made judges stand, teaches us profound lessons. First, it teaches us that age and size and experience are not what determine greatness. Neil was just a little kid who looked too small and too young to do anything significant, but when he opened his mouth and sang, none of that mattered. The talent was real, regardless of the package it came in. Second, this story teaches us about the importance of encouragement. Mrs. Goldstein saw something in Neil and encouraged him to perform. His mother helped him practice and spoke words of encouragement when he was frozen with fear. Those people believing in him made it possible for him to believe in himself enough to try. We all need people who see our potential and encourage us to pursue it. Third, the story illustrates that courage is not the absence of fear, but action despite fear. Neil was absolutely terrified that night. He almost backed out multiple times, but he did not let the fear stop him. He felt the fear and sang anyway. That is real courage, and it is available to everyone, regardless of age or circumstance. Fourth, this story shows us that breakthrough moments often come when we are most vulnerable. Neil was at his most exposed and vulnerable on that stage, small and scared, and barely able to reach the microphone. But it was in that moment of vulnerability, when he had nothing to hide behind and nothing to rely on except his voice, that his true gift revealed itself. Sometimes we have to risk vulnerability to discover what we are capable of. Fifth, the story teaches us about the power of recognition and validation. The standing ovation from the judges and audience did not create Neil's talent, but it validated it. It told him that what he felt inside, the pull toward music, was real and valuable. That validation gave him permission to pursue his gift seriously. The story also reminds us about the role of supportive parents. Neil's mother and father could have dismissed his musical interest as childish and impractical. They could have refused to let him perform, protecting him from potential failure. Instead, though they had concerns, they supported him. They let him try. They believed in him. That support made all the difference. Neil Diamond's journey from that 6-year-old boy barely reaching the microphone to becoming a global superstar shows us the importance of early experiences in shaping our lives. That one performance planted a seed that would grow throughout his life. He would face many more moments of fear and doubt in his career, many rejections and setbacks, but he would always be able to draw on that memory of pushing through terror and finding success on the other side. Looking at Neil's entire career, that night at PS 174 stands as the foundation. Every stadium show, every hit record, every moment of fame, all of it traced back to a scared little boy deciding to sing despite his terror. The confidence he gained that night grew over decades until he became one of the most commanding performers in music, famous for his ability to connect with audiences and move them emotionally. Thank you for listening to this beautiful true story of courage, talent, and the moment when a legend was born. I hope it has inspired you to face your own fears, to share your own gifts even when you are scared, to remember that everyone who has ever achieved anything great started small and scared and unsure. Remember, Neil Diamond was a 6-year-old boy who could barely reach the microphone, terrified and tiny on a big stage. But when he sang, the judges stood up. Your beginning does not determine your ending. Your fear does not define your future. What defines you is whether you have the courage to try despite the fear. Subscribe to this channel for more inspiring true stories like this one, and remember that inside every great artist was once a scared child who decided to be brave.